In the spring of 1984, David Chen, the 28-year-old branch manager of the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Harmony Creek, Nebraska, told Arthur Miller he was a bad risk for a $2,000 loan. It was the last time he ever judged a man's wealth by the numbers on a single sheet of paper. Let me tell you about Harmony Creek. In 1984, it had a population of 1,247, down from 1,512 a decade earlier. It had one main street, one stoplight that blinked yellow after 9 p.m., a grain elevator that was the tallest structure for 40 miles, and the bank. The bank was the town's heart and its fist. It had been founded in 1902 with local money from 7 farmers and a doctor, a fact etched on a bronze plaque that David Chen had briefly considered removing for a more modern corporate logo. He was talked out of it by the head teller, a woman who had worked there for 38 years and knew the names of the 7 founding farmers' great-grandchildren. The bank sat on the corner of Main and Elm, a solid brick building that smelled of old paper, floor polish, and the faint, ever-present anxiety of debt. 1984 was a bad year to be in the business of farming, which meant it was a bad year to be in the business of lending to farmers. Interest rates were clawing their way down from the stratosphere, but a prime rate of 12% was still a knife at the throat of any man trying to make a living from the soil. Farm foreclosures were not just stories in the Des Moines Register. They were happening 2 counties over. An auctioneer's bill tacked to the board in the post office was a common sight. The list of tractors and combines and household goods, a quiet obituary for a family's way of life. The air in Harmony Creek was thick with a particular kind of dread, the fear that the land your grandfather broke with a mule team could be lost because of a number decided by a man in a boardroom 1,500 miles away. Into this atmosphere walked David Chen in September of 1983. He came from Omaha, armed with an MBA from Creighton University and a profound belief in the elegant certainty of financial models. He was sent by the new parent company, a regional holding corporation out of Kansas City that had bought Farmers and Merchants the year before. His mandate was clear: tighten lending standards, mitigate risk, and bring the branch's portfolio in line with modern banking practices. He was polite, he was professional, he wore a tie every day, and he drove a new Ford Tempo. He saw Harmony Creek not as a community of interconnected families, but as a collection of accounts, each with a FICO score, a debt-to-asset ratio, and a demonstrable capacity to service new debt. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man who believed the map was more real than the territory. Arthur Miller was the territory. He was 62 years old and had been farming the same 240-acre plot his entire life. He was born in the same farmhouse he now lived in, a 2-story clapboard structure built by his grandfather in 1911. He had taken over the farm from his father in 1955, the year he married Elspeth. For 45 of his 62 years, he had worked that land. He knew its moods, its low spots that held water after a rain, its sandy ridge on the North 40 that dried out too fast. He knew the sound of the wind when it meant hail, and the smell of the air when it meant a soaking rain was finally coming. His hands were thick, the knuckles swollen, the skin permanently ingrained with the soil of his home. He was known for 2 things. He never missed a Sunday service at the Lutheran Church, and his word was better than any contract. He had banked at Farmers and Merchants his whole life. His father had banked there. His grandfather had been one of the 7 men on the bronze plaque. The problem was not the farm. The problem was a Gould's J1OS shallow well pump, or what was left of it. The pump, which drew water from the creek to irrigate the 20 acres where he grew his vegetables and feed corn, had been installed by his father in 1961. It had been repaired 4 times in the last decade, twice by Arthur himself, using parts he'd scavenged from a neighbour's junk pile. But now its bearings were shot. It screamed like a dying animal for 10 minutes before sputtering into silence. The local repairman, a man named Gus, who was even older than Arthur, had taken one look at it, wiped his hands on an oily rag, and shaken his head. "It's done, Art," he'd said. "You can't patch a ghost." A new pump, installed, would cost $2,150. Arthur had $482 in his checking account. The payment for the seed he'd bought in February had cleared out most of his cash reserves. It was March 12, 1984. The ground was thawing. He needed to get the fields ready. And the old-timers were all saying the same thing. It was going to be a dry summer. They saw it in the way the geese flew north, in the tightness of the buds on the lilac bushes, in the pale, hazy quality of the morning sun. A dry summer without an irrigation pump wasn't a risk. It was a death sentence for half his cash crop. So Arthur Miller did what he had done only 3 other times in his adult life. He went to the bank to ask for a loan. He sat in the chair opposite David Chen's desk. The chair was new, a sleek black thing with chrome arms that felt cold and unwelcoming. The old wooden chairs had been given to the church basement. Arthur's file was on the desk between them. It was a thick manila folder, bulging with decades of transactions. David Chen had a single sheet of paper next to it, a printout from his new computer. The computer was another change. It hummed quietly, a low electronic sound that seemed alien in the quiet wood-panelled office. David Chen was the picture of calm professionalism. He began by calling him Mr. Miller. Arthur had been Art to the previous bank manager for 30 years. "Mr. Miller," David began, his fingers steepled. "Thank you for coming in. I've run the numbers on your application." He slid the single sheet of paper across the desk. It was covered in columns and percentages. "As you know, the agricultural economy is in a state of flux. The corporation has instructed us to be extremely cautious with our lending, especially for operational costs that aren't directly tied to appreciating assets." Arthur didn't look at the paper. He looked at the young man's face. He saw no malice there, only a kind of placid certainty. "David," he said, his voice quiet, "I need a pump. The old one is gone. No pump, no water. No water, no corn. It's that simple." "I understand the causality, Mr. Miller," David said. He tapped the paper. "But the numbers are what they are. Your outstanding mortgage is $42,000. You have a line of credit for your equipment with John Deere for $18,500. Based on last year's yields and the current commodity prices for corn and soy, your projected income for this year leaves a very thin margin, a dangerously thin margin. Your debt-to-asset ratio is at 68%. The bank's guideline for a new unsecured loan is a maximum of 55%. Arthur was silent. He understood the words, but the logic felt foreign. He wasn't asking for a vacation. He was asking for a tool to do his work, the work that paid the mortgage and the credit line. "The pump isn't a vacation," he said. "It makes the money to pay the bills." "In a good year," David countered smoothly. "But the forecasts are for a dry season. A significant drought could depress your yields, and a bumper crop elsewhere could depress prices. We have to model for the worst-case scenario. And in that scenario, an additional $2,150 loan at the current interest rate of 14.75% would put your operation in a precarious position. Frankly, it would be irresponsible for me to approve it." Irresponsible. The word hung in the air. Arthur Miller had never been called irresponsible in his life. He had paid his bills on time for 40 years. He had never missed a payment, ever. He had pulled his son out of agricultural college for a year in '73 to help bring in the harvest after he'd broken his leg. He had sold 10 acres of his best land his grandfather had cleared by hand, to his neighbor at a discount in '79 when the neighbor's wife got sick and they needed money for hospital bills in Rochester. Irresponsible was not a word that belonged in the same room as Arthur Miller. He said nothing. He just looked at the young man who held his farm's future on a single sheet of paper.
He felt a weariness that went deeper than his bones. It was the weariness of a man who realized the rules he had lived by his entire life had been changed without his knowledge. "I've been a customer here for 62 years, Arthur said finally. It wasn't an argument.
It was a statement of fact, like saying the sky was blue.
"And we appreciate your loyalty, Mr. Miller," David said, his tone unchanged. "But the bank is no longer a local institution. We have shareholders to answer to. We have federal regulators. Loyalty is not a quantifiable asset." That was it. That was the line. Loyalty is not a quantifiable asset. Arthur stood up. The new chair made a soft hiss. He put his old farmer's cap back on his head. "Thank you for your time," he said. He did not offer to shake hands. He turned and walked out of the office, past the head teller, who saw the look on his face and knew immediately what had happened, and out into the cool March air. The bell above the bank's heavy oak door tinkled softly behind him, a sound he had heard thousands of times, a sound that suddenly felt like a farewell. He drove the 3 miles home in his 1972 Ford pickup. He didn't turn on the radio. He watched the fields, still brown and dormant, waiting. He felt like he had failed. Not just himself, but his father and his grandfather. The weight of the 240 acres, of the house, of the name settled on his shoulders. Elspeth was in the kitchen when he came in. She was 60 years old, with the same calm, steady eyes she'd had when he married her at 20. She was wiping down the large oak table that had been in her family for a century. She didn't need to ask what happened. She saw it in the way he hung his coat, in the slow, deliberate way he sat down at the table, a place he never sat in the middle of the day. She poured him a cup of coffee from the percolator on the stove and sat down across from him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the regulator clock on the wall. Finally, Arthur spoke. He said no. Elspeth nodded. She waited. "He said I was a bad risk," Arthur continued, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Said my debt-to-asset ratio was too high."
Said loyalty wasn't a quantifiable asset. He repeated the phrase as if it were a piece of rotten fruit he couldn't get out of his mouth. Elspeth looked at her husband's hands resting on the oak table. She knew the story of every scar, every callus. She knew the work those hands had done. She thought of David Chen, the new banker. She had met him once at the church potluck. He had soft hands and a confident smile. He had talked about his portfolio management strategies. He seemed to her like a man who knew how to read a book, but not how to read the weather. She stood up and went into the pantry, a small, cool room off the kitchen. It smelled of earth and dried herbs and apples. She came back with a small wooden box. It was made of cedar and was unadorned except for the initials E.G. burned into the lid. E.G. was Elspeth's great-grandmother, Elsbeth Gutmann, who had come from a small village in the Black Forest of Germany in 1874. Arthur watched as she placed the box on the table and opened it. Inside, nestled in faded cotton, were dozens of small hand-stitched cloth bags. Each bag was no bigger than the palm of her hand. They were made of old flour sacks, scraps of dresses, bits of canvas. On each bag, a name was written in faded ink in a neat, cursive hand. Mortgage Lifter Tomato, 1948. Brandywine Pink, 1952. Stowell's Evergreen Sweet Corn, 1935. German Pink Bean, 1888. This was Elspeth's work. It had been her mother's work, and her grandmother's, and her great-grandmother's before that. It was the Miller family's other account. Let me tell you about that account. It was not held at the Farmers and Merchants Bank. It paid no interest. It was not insured by the FDIC.
Its assets were not measured in dollars, but in germination rates. Its deposits were made each fall and its withdrawals each spring. This was the family's seed bank.
When Elsbeth Gutman came to Nebraska, she brought very little with her: a trunk with 2 dresses, a Bible, and a small leather pouch. In the pouch were seeds for a deep red meaty tomato that didn't crack in the summer heat, seeds for a pole bean that produced prolifically even in poor soil, seeds for a hardy cabbage that could be stored in the root cellar well into February. These were not commodities. They were heirlooms, the accumulated wisdom of generations of German farmers, a genetic library of survival. She planted them in her first small garden next to the sod house her husband built. Each year, she saved the best seeds from the strongest, healthiest, most flavorful plants. She selected for traits that mattered in the harsh Nebraska climate: drought tolerance, disease resistance, early maturation. She taught her daughter how to do it, how to tell a good seed from a bad one by its weight and color, how to dry them properly on a screen in the attic, how to store them in cloth bags so they could breathe, how to mark them with the year of harvest. Her daughter, Martha, added to the collection. She traded seeds with the other farm wives, with the Sioux women who lived near the river. She added a drought-resistant squash, a blue flower corn, a small, intensely sweet melon. Martha taught her daughter Eleanor, who was Elspeth's mother. Eleanor was the one who started keeping a logbook, a simple school notebook where she recorded the performance of each variety year after year. 1934, the Great Drought. The German pink bean was the only bean that produced. The sweet corn failed entirely. The mortgage lifter tomatoes produced, but the fruit was small. The logbook was a story of survival, a 50-year conversation with the land. Elspeth inherited the box and the book when she married Arthur in 1955. She took on the responsibility with a quiet reverence. For 40 years she had been the curator of this living history. Arthur was the farmer, the man who worked the fields, but Elspeth was the keeper of the farm's genetic soul. The seeds they planted in their large garden, the ones that fed them through the year, did not come from a catalogue. They came from this box. The corn they grew to feed their few cows and pigs was not a modern hybrid, bred for uniformity and dependent on heavy inputs of fertilizer and water. It was an open pollinated variety, Stowell's Evergreen, that they had been growing for 50 years. It didn't have the record-breaking yields of the hybrids their neighbors grew, the ones they had to buy new seed for every single year from Pioneer or DeKalb. But their corn could handle a dry spell. It had been selected for that trait over decades. It was resilient. It was, in a word, dependable. The neighbors had all switched to hybrids in the 60s and 70s. It was the modern way. The salesmen from the seed companies came with their glossy brochures and their yield charts. They promised bigger harvests, more bushels per acre, and they delivered, for a time. But the new seeds required more nitrogen, more pesticides, and most of all, more water. Their root systems were shallower. They were bred for ideal conditions, not for the harsh realities of a Nebraska summer. They were brittle. The farmers had traded resilience for yield. They had, without realizing it, outsourced their farm's future to a distant corporation. They had to buy the seed every spring, on credit. They were locked in a cycle of debt and dependency. Arthur and Elspeth were considered old-fashioned, stubborn even. Their neighbors' fields were a uniform sea of green, every stalk the same height. Arthur's cornfield was a little ragged, a little uneven. It was a field, not a factory floor. Elspeth looked at the cloth bags on her kitchen table. Then she looked at her husband, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She saw the 40 years of his labor, the trust he had placed in the system that had just told him he was no longer valuable. A quiet, cold anger began to form in her chest.
It was the anger of a mother defending her child, the anger of a steward defending her trust. She picked up one of the bags. It was a heavy canvas stitched with thick red thread. The label, in her mother's handwriting, read, "Miller's Resilient Field Corn, 1968 to present." This was their own variety, a cross between the Stowell's Evergreen and a local variety a neighbour had given them just before the bank foreclosed on his farm in '68. Elspeth and her mother had worked on it for years, selecting for strong stalks, deep roots, and ears that filled out even with less rain. It was their masterpiece. It was their answer to the Nebraska wind and the summer sun. "Arthur," she said, her voice was calm, but it had a core of steel he hadn't heard in years. "You go out and fix the fence on the north pasture."
I'm going to the bank. He looked up, confused. What for? You said no. He was looking at the wrong ledger, she said. She stood up and began to carefully place a selection of the small cloth bags into a larger canvas shopping bag. He was looking at your account. He needs to see the other one. Arthur didn't argue. He had been married to Elspeth for 40 years. He knew this tone of voice. He simply nodded, put his cap back on, and went out to the barn. Elspeth put on her good coat, the one she wore to church. She took the car, the 1978 Buick sedan they kept for special occasions. She drove the 3 miles into town, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She did not drive to the bank, not yet. She drove to the co-op, to the diner, and to the post office. She made 3 quiet phone calls. Then she drove to the bank. She walked in just before noon. The bank was busier than it had been that morning. There were 3 other farmers waiting to see David Chen. They were men Arthur had known his whole life. John Peterson, whose family had the dairy herd, Frank Miller, a distant cousin who grew soy, and old Bill Jensen, who was semi-retired but still farmed 80 acres. They all nodded when Elspeth walked in. They had heard. News in Harmony Creek travelled faster than the telegraph. They knew Arthur had been turned down. They were there to see what would happen next. Or perhaps Elspeth's phone calls had summoned them. The head teller, Margaret, saw Elspeth and her face softened with sympathy. "Elspeth, I'm so sorry about Arthur." "Is Mr. Chen available?" Elspeth asked, her voice polite but firm. "He's with someone." "I'll wait," Elspeth said, and she took a seat on the hard wooden bench against the wall. The 3 other farmers sat with her. None of them spoke. It was not a protest. It was a bearing of witness. 20 minutes later, David Chen's door opened. He escorted a customer out, smiling his professional smile. Then he saw Elspeth and the 3 other farmers sitting on the bench. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He recovered quickly. "Mrs. Miller," he said, walking over, "I'm afraid I've already spoken with your husband. The bank's position hasn't changed." He spoke in a low, confidential tone, as if to save her from public embarrassment. Elspeth stood up. She was not a tall woman, but she seemed to have an unshakable gravity. "I'm not here to talk about the bank's position, Mr. Chen. I'm here to provide you with additional information about my husband's assets. May we speak in your office?" David was taken aback. The other farmers were watching. To refuse would be unseemly. "Of course," he said, and led her into his office, closing the door behind them. The other 3 men remained on the bench, waiting. Elspeth sat in the same cold black chair her husband had occupied that morning. She placed her canvas shopping bag on her lap. "Mrs. Miller," David began, settling behind his desk, his professionalism a shield. "As I explained to your husband, this isn't a personal decision. It's a matter of financial metrics. You said loyalty was not a quantifiable asset." Elspeth said, cutting him off, it was not a question. "That's correct," he said. "From the bank's perspective, it's an intangible." "I see," Elspeth said. "And I suppose resilience is also an intangible." "In a manner of speaking, yes. We can model for risk, but—" "You model for risk," she interrupted again, her voice still quiet. But you do not model for strength. You see debt, but you do not see worth. You have one ledger, Mr. Chen. My husband's farm has two. She reached into her bag and took out the small cloth sacks, one by one, and placed them on his polished desk. The small, lumpy bags looked ancient and out of place next to his humming computer and neat stacks of paper. "What is this?" he asked, confused. "This is my husband's other account," Elspeth said. She opened his other account. She touched the first bag, the heavy canvas one. "This is Miller's Resilient Field Corn. My mother and I developed it. It has a root system that goes down 5 feet. Your hybrid seed corn roots go down 2, maybe 3 feet. When the topsoil dries out in August, which corn do you think will find water, Mr. Chen?" She pointed to another bag. "This is the German pink bean. My great-grandmother brought it here in 1874. In the drought of 1934, when this entire county was a dust bowl, my grandfather was one of 3 farmers who had a bean crop to sell. It kept this farm from going under." She laid out 5 more bags, a tomato, a squash, a melon. With each one, she told a story of a specific year, a specific challenge, a specific victory. She was not emotional. She spoke with the calm, factual authority of a historian. She was reciting the lines from the logbook of her family's survival. "Your business is numbers, Mr. Chen. So let me give you some. The hybrid seed your customers are buying costs them about $80 a bag, enough for 2 acres. They have to buy it every year, and they have to borrow the money to do it. Our seed costs us nothing. We've been growing it for 50 years. We have 20 bushels of it stored in our barn right now, enough to plant our fields for the next 3 years, even if we have a total crop failure." She paused, letting the silence settle in the room. "Your customers are leveraged to the seed companies. We are not. Your customers' crops are fragile. Ours are resilient. You call this an intangible. I call it collateral. This isn't a collection of seeds, Mr. Chen. It is a 110-year record of surviving and thriving in this exact place, under these exact conditions. It is the most valuable thing we own. It is the reason Arthur Miller has never, not once, missed a payment to this bank in 40 years. David Chen was speechless. He stared at the humble cloth bags on his desk. He had an MBA. He had studied discounted cash flows and regression analysis. He had been trained to see the world as a series of predictable, quantifiable risks. Nothing in his education had prepared him for this. He was being confronted with a form of wealth he had no way to measure, no box to check on his forms. The map he had been given did not show this territory. He looked past Elspeth through the glass wall of his office. He saw the 3 other farmers still sitting on the bench watching him. They were not smiling. They were not threatening. They were simply waiting. He suddenly understood that his decision was not about one $2,150 loan. It was about which world he was going to live in, the world of his spreadsheets or the world of these people. He looked back at Elspeth. Her eyes were clear and steady. She was not asking for a favor. She was presenting evidence. He picked up one of the bags. The seeds inside made a soft, rattling sound. It felt heavy, substantial. He looked at the faded ink on the cloth. Mortgage Lifter Tomato, 1948. He thought about the name. Mortgage Lifter. A story was there, a story of value that his numbers could not capture. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Miller," he said, and his voice was different now, less confident, more thoughtful. "Let me re-examine the application." Elspeth simply nodded. She gathered her cloth bags, leaving one, the Miller's Resilient Field Corn, on his desk. "You keep that one," she said, "as a reminder. There is more than one way to count."
She stood up and walked out of the office. She nodded to the three farmers on the bench and they stood up with her. Together they walked out of the bank. The bell above the door tinkled. The loan was approved an hour later. David Chen called Arthur himself. His voice was formal, but the arrogance was gone. He said the bank had reconsidered the unique assets of the Miller farm.
Arthur just said, "Thank you," and hung up. The new pump was installed 2 days later, and the old-timers were right. The summer of 1984 was brutal. A drought settled over the plains in June and did not break until a brief thunderstorm in late August. The temperature stayed above 95 degrees for 27 straight days in July. The creeks ran low. The fields of hybrid corn, the ones owned by Arthur's neighbours, began to suffer. The shallow-rooted stalks turned a sickly yellow-green. The leaves curled up, trying to conserve moisture. The ears, when they formed at all, were small and stunted. Arthur's fields were different. His corn was not as tall as his neighbours', but it was a deep, healthy green. The roots, reaching deep into the subsoil, found the moisture that the other crops could not. With the water from his new pump on the vegetable patch and his resilient corn in the main field, his farm looked like an oasis in a parched landscape. In September, the harvest told the story. John Peterson, the dairy farmer, had his corn yield drop by 40%. He couldn't afford to buy feed, so he had to sell off a third of his herd at rock-bottom prices. Frank Miller's soybeans were a near total loss. The bank had to extend his operating loan into the next year, adding to his mountain of debt. Arthur Miller's harvest was down, but only by 10%. He had enough corn to feed his animals through the winter, and enough left over to sell. His tomatoes and beans, watered from the creek, had produced a bumper crop. He made enough that year to pay off the pump loan in a single payment in November. He walked into the bank and handed David Chen a check for $2,238.42. He didn't say a word. He just slid the check across the counter. David Chen did not stay in Harmony Creek. The parent corporation transferred him to a larger branch in a suburban area outside Kansas City the next year. They said it was a promotion, but the people in Harmony Creek knew he had failed his test. He had been sent to manage risk, and he had failed to recognize the biggest asset in the county: resilience. The man who replaced him was from a town 50 miles away. He understood farming. He made loans based on character as much as on collateral. The bronze plaque with the founder's name stayed on the wall. The story of Elspeth Miller and the cloth bags became a quiet legend in the county. It wasn't told loudly. It was told at kitchen tables, in the co-op, over a fence line. It became a parable about the two kinds of wealth, the kind you can count and the kind that counts. The farm crisis of the 80s deepened. More auctions appeared on the post office bulletin board. But the Miller farm survived. They never got rich. They never bought a fancy new combine. They continued to drive their old Ford truck. But they held on. They owned their land free and clear by 1995. Arthur Miller passed away in 2002 at the age of 80. He died in the same house he was born in. Elspeth lived on for another 10 years, still tending her garden, still saving her seeds. Her son, Michael, the one who'd had to leave college for a year, had eventually come back to the farm with his wife. He had been skeptical of the old ways at first. He had wanted to modernize, to expand. But he had seen what happened in 84. He had seen the neighbors' farms fail while his families endured. He learned to listen. He learned the stories of the seeds. When Elspeth passed in 2012, Michael's daughter Sarah took over the stewardship of the wooden box. She was 25 years old and had a degree in agronomy from the University of Nebraska. She took the old logbook her great-grandmother had started and digitized it. She started a small business selling heirloom seeds to gardeners and small farmers across the country.
She called it the Harmony Creek Seed Company.
On the homepage of her website, she told the story of her great-great-great-grandmother, Elsbeth Gutmann, and the pouch of seeds she brought from Germany. She told the story of 1984. The bag of Miller's resilient field corn stayed on David Chen's desk for a year. He never planted it. He didn't know how. It was a silent rebuke, a reminder of a language he did not speak. When he was transferred, he left it behind. The new manager, not knowing what it was, threw it in a drawer. 20 years later, in 2005, David Chen, now a senior vice president for risk management at a large bank in Chicago, was giving a presentation to a group of young analysts. He was talking about systemic risk, about black swan events, about the hidden vulnerabilities in complex systems. He clicked to a new slide. On the screen was a picture of a single, humble, hand-stitched cloth bag.
"Let me tell you a story," he began, "about a farmer in Nebraska and about the difference between price and value. A bank measures wealth in dollars and cents. The land measures wealth in seasons and survival. One is an idea written on paper or stored as a bit of data in a machine. The other is a living thing, a truth held in the palm of your hand. The Miller farm survived not because of what was in their bank account, but because of what was in their soil, in their history, in their hands. They understood that the most important assets are the ones you cannot quantify, the ones a man in a suit will never see on a spreadsheet. They understood that what is rigid breaks, but what adapts endures. That was the lesson of the other account.